When Chuck Schuldiner was just 9 years old, his 16-year-old brother Frank Schuldiner sadly died in a car accident. Hoping it would help him to deal with the pain of this traumatic loss, his parents bought him his first guitar. It was an electric guitar purchased at a yard sale. Chuck's mother and father also decided to pay for him to have guitar lessons. However, this was with an acoustic guitar, and he didn't seem to be very fond of this, which is no surprise given what he later accomplished in life musically. Chuck was impatient with the acoustic guitar lessons, and we never forced him to go. When he wanted to stop them, he did. I'm sure there was no time for her to realize any latent talent, but it sure made a difference to Chuck. Little did they know this tragic event would place Chuck on the path to becoming what some would call him the godfather of death metal. Prior to this, Chuck, along with his older brother and sister, Frank and Beth, led an incredibly normal and productive childhood with seemingly very loving parents and siblings. Chuck's childhood was what has been called a leave it to beaver life. When Chuck was a year old, we moved to Florida, in an area that was largely undeveloped at the time, with woods surrounding us. Chuck and his brother Frank and sister Beth grew up playing in these woods, building forts in the trees, and seeing quite a lot of wildlife there also. Chuck and Frank, his brother, camped out in the backyard with flashlights and snacks lots of the times, and there were many of the children in the neighborhood at the house most days. At the end, he thanked me for the golden memories of his childhood. Charles Michael Schuldiner was born on May the 13th, 1967 in New York, or Chuck for short. As a kid, he took up an early interest in all things creative and was a regular active child. He was interested in art and sculpture and also played soccer, but his main interest was always music. His father listened to a wide range of music, so Chuck was exposed to this from an early age. It was only a few years after the tragic loss of his brother Frank that Chuck started his first band in the garage at home. When he was around 15, he would play his first public show at a nearby park in Altamonte Springs, Florida. His first band would be called Mantas, but that only lasted for around 4 months before changing the name to Death. And it seems as if the loss of his brother Frank was once again a deciding factor here. Frank and Chuck were very close. That closeness is surely why the devastation Chuck felt at the tragic death of his brother and the consequences following it were so great that he never really came to terms with it. He always missed Frank. The death of Frank brought this family very close together, and that closeness has continued always. Along with Chuck's main influences such as Anvil, Merciful Fate, Exciter, Venom, Hellhammer, and Celtic Frost, there was a local band that had started to see some success. This was a band that Chuck somewhat looked up to and felt inspired by.
If you look at thrash metal bands' album covers, they're all the same, kind of cliched. They're death, doom, destruction. They got fire and screaming and people yelling. But Nasty Savage wanted to do something a little different using the artistic value. And we had this painter do it. He's an old painter. He happens to be a warlock. And it was his interpretation of indulgence. Rather than say there's one meaning to indulgence, this is the way, you have to listen to what I say. It's more broad, where you can get your own meaning out of it. You can dig deep and find out for yourself and get your own meaning out of the painting.
Yeah, the metal battle, Nasty Savage! We're going to destroy tomorrow!
Nasty Savage was a big inspiration to me in the beginning because they were a real band. I remember still being in high school and I saw them play, and I remember them being so professional, heavy, and those are some real special times. I still look back on those with a lot of cool memories. It was definitely a major influence to see Nasty Savage. They had this killer demo out, Wage of Mayhem. I just remember looking up to them as being so professional and inspirational as well. I remember thinking that they were going to be massive. I remember honestly telling my friend that they were going to be as big as Priest one day.
The witches cry.
Nasty Savage were a band formed in Florida in 1983. They quickly became popular in the local scene and signed to Metal Blade Records, releasing their first self-titled studio album in 1985. Metal Blade Records, as I'm sure most of you all know, famously released Slayer's first two albums, Show No Mercy in 1983 and Hell Awaits in 1985. Metal Blade have also released every single Cannibal Corpse studio album since their debut in 1990 with Eaten Back to Life. And it wouldn't be long before Chuck's band Death would follow a similar path to those he looked up to. Between 1984 to 1986, Mantas and Death as a band would record several rehearsal tapes, demos, live tapes that included Rigor Mortis, Back from the Dead, Death by Metal, Reign of Terror, and of course Mutilation. All of which were technically classed as a self-release as there was no record label involved. Also important to point out that Death had a different vocalist in the beginning, Cam Lee, who also played drums on some of these recordings. However, by the time Death released their 1985 demo, Back from the Dead, in October of that year, Chuck had taken over vocals permanently as Cam was no longer in the band. I was lucky to start playing guitar in the 80s when so many great players were around to inspire me, like Yngwie Malmsteen, Van Halen, and especially Dave Murray and Adrian Smith of Iron Maiden. Although the early days of Death had seen some instability with several lineup changes, this wouldn't stop Chuck Schuldiner from recording one of the greatest death metal records of all time.
Every radio station, the death metal is the only true rebellion side of rock and roll, rebellious side.
I think it's just going to be like how Metallica was. I remember when Metallica was like the Outcast type of music, type of band. It's an evolution, and people are going to be looking for heavier stuff, and there's definitely a lot of bands out there to supply the metal needs that people are, you know, out there demanding. I mean, like you said, a lot of people write in, they want to hear heavy stuff. Well, this is, I think, the next generation, definitely, and, you know, we're all very psyched, definitely.
Scream Bloody Gore, the first studio album to be released by Death on the 25th of May 1987, is considered by many to be the first real death metal record, and was written entirely by Chuck Schuldiner. Some would argue that Seven Churches by Possessed is also a contender for this title. However, many agree that this album is far more thrash orientated.
How do Possessed feel about being called thrash metal? Are you a thrash metal band? Well, we were in the beginning. It's like we still really are. I mean, we still have a lot of speed to us and stuff like that as far as our music goes. But as far as being called black metal or something like that, we don't really consider ourselves that anymore. But the thrash metal, I'd say it's more thrash and heavy metal kind of mixed is the way we feel about it.
Scream Bloody Gore would be released via Combat Records and produced by Chuck Schuldiner and Randy Burns. Randy Burns also produced Seven Churches by Possessed, Peace Sells But Who's Buying by Megadeth in 1986, and Darkness Descends by Dark Angel, a thrash metal band from California. Combat Records, formed in 1983, released the first Megadeth record, Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good, in 1985, along with Seven Churches by Possessed and Darkness Descends by Dark Angel. And I think it's safe to say that by the time Scream Bloody Gore was released, thrash metal, along with bands such as Venom, had already established a wide presence in terms of exposing people to more styles of extreme metal music. I don't know if it's definitely cool that people give Death credit. We hung in there, but I have to give credit to other bands as well, like Venom and Celtic Frost, and all who were early influences that inspired us. Not just death metal, but other bands like Anvil, Exciter, and Raven. But it's great to be acknowledged for at least helping. The general population, however, were far more concerned with much lighter music. On the week of release of Scream Bloody Gore, the Billboard 200 saw U2, Bon Jovi, Poison, and Whitesnake topping the charts, along with Fleetwood Mac. Not exactly what you'd call extreme music.
Tell me lies, tell me sweet little lies.
However, Among the Living by Anthrax was sitting pretty at number 62 and had spent 8 weeks on the chart up to that point. And believe it or not, Join the Army by Suicidal Tendencies was at number 140, with Peace Sells But Who's Buying by Megadeth sat just 2 spots below that.
Power! Yes, power! Show them all his power!
So this was an era where thrash and heavy metal definitely had their share of public attention. Death metal, however, was a completely different coffin of skulls.
You know, they're loving that. Got their cigarettes in there ready to go. Fucking.
Aside from the music itself being slightly more dynamically different from more dominant genres of the era, the artwork and lyrics also hinted at something much darker. The artwork itself, which you could say is a clear depiction of death itself. This artwork was created by Edward J. Repka. Edward J. Repka is an American graphic artist that really doesn't receive the credit he deserves. Not only is he responsible for the artwork on Scream Bloody Gore, he's also the man behind Holy Wars, The Punishment Due, Peace Sells But Who's Buying, Hangar 18, Rust in Peace, and many others. Repka would also go on to design the second and third Death records, Leprosy and Spiritual Healing. When Chuck formed Death in 1983, he was around 15 years old, and when Death's debut album was released in 1987, he was just 20. And considering Scream Bloody Gore is widely accepted as the first real death metal record, that is quite an impressive achievement.
But I really can't consider myself to have started it. I think bands like Venom, in my opinion, Venom were the first.
You could easily compare this to the likes of, say, Metallica. Upon the release of their debut album, Kill 'Em All, in 1983, they were all around 20 years old. And it seems to come as no coincidence that Scream Bloody Gore lyrically dealt with very morbid topics. Song titles such as Infernal Death, Evil Dead, and Baptized in Blood may give the impression of an anti-religious view, or even pushing towards satanic. However, Chuck wanted nothing to do with the satanic aspect of metal, and although he was raised in a religious environment, with his mother being a Christian and his father being Jewish, he was never forced to follow any religious teachings. As mentioned previously, some motivation for exploring such topics came from the tragic and untimely loss of his 16-year-old brother when Chuck was just 9. Although by this time, bands such as Slayer and Venom had essentially heavily relied on people thinking their music was about satanic worship as a kind of marketing strategy. Venom's debut record in 1981, Welcome to Hell, and Slayer's first album both depict a pentagram along with a representation of Baphomet, a deity often linked to satanic worship. Whereas Scream Bloody Gore made no such reference to this type of symbolism within its artwork. It is quite difficult though to look at this artwork and not immediately assume that there may be some sort of link to Satanism. But if the inspiration wasn't Satanism, then what was it? In an interview with a German magazine in 1986 and Metal Forces magazine in 1987, Chuck said the following when asked about the cover for Death's upcoming debut record and lyrical content. The album will be called Scream Bloody Gore and will contain 11 songs. It will be extremely heavy, fast, and tight. It will have zombies drinking maggots and guts. It will be great. Lyrics come to me from watching cool gore flicks or just from my mind, especially when I'm fucked up. That's when I write good music also. I'm really not interested in it all, to tell you the truth. We had some satanic lyrics back in the old days, but most of those were written by our former drummer and vocalist, Cam Lee. As soon as he left the band, I kind of took control of that side of things, since I'm the vocalist now. My lyrics are based more on the subject of death and real-life gore. I get a lot of ideas from seeing gore flicks. For example, Torn to Pieces is about the movie Make Them Die Slowly, and Scream Bloody Gore is about Reanimator. Some of the horror films Chuck would be inspired by lyrically on Scream Bloody Gore were Reanimator.
Once you wake up the dead, you've got a real mess on your hands.
The Beyond. Gene Hoglan, the drummer for Death from 1993 to 1995, said this in an interview regarding Chuck's love for gore flicks. I know Chuck wrote super gory lyrics for Scream Bloody Gore. He grew up on horror flicks, and that was considered heavy at the time. The new stuff, while being a bit more intelligent, is still scary to Chuck. He looks around and sees stuff that interests him or things in reality that scare him. After all, when you're 18, you say, what can I say to shock people? But now Chuck writes lyrics that make you think. Sometimes things in today's society are much scarier than horror. Scream Bloody Gore would not only become the first death metal album, but it was also the start of what would become an iconic and long-lasting legacy for Chuck Schuldiner and his band, Death. Throughout the years, Death would go through numerous lineup changes. Shortly after Scream Bloody Gore had hit the shelves, Death would consist of Rick Ross, Terry Butler, Bill Andrews, and of course Chuck. Bill Andrews would later join American death metal group Massacre, and Terry Butler would join 6 Feet Under, a band formed by Chris Barnes, the original singer for Cannibal Corpse. Butler was also a member of Massacre.
Lost in the shadows.
People need to understand that while I wish there were never any lineup changes, some are inevitable. You can't stop them, or else you'll end up like everybody else wants you to be. And that might be something straightforward, or for some people, even backward. I've always wanted to go forward because I think you have to do that in life. Why live it? Hopefully this is a really, really good lineup, and we're very happy with the way things are going. This lineup would be present for the recording and release of the second Death record, Leprosy, released on November the 16th, 1988. And it was produced by Scott Burns.
The man
Scott Burns would become a notable figure in the death metal world, going on to work with the likes of Sepultura, Obituary, Deicide, and of course, Cannibal Corpse. For the death metal genre, producing was more about being responsible for trying to get a high quality recording and making minor changes to the song's arrangements if possible. In the beginning, most of the recordings were done in about 7 to 14 days, so that's pretty quick. And the labels were willing to let you run over budget and ask for an additional $10,000 to finish. As a way to make up for time, we typically worked more than our 12-hour-a-day block of studio time. So if we could get in 14 to 18 hours in a day, that would be equivalent of having a larger budget. You could say death metal was still pretty much in its infancy, and one aspect of what makes a band grow is a heavy touring schedule, especially back then before the advent of social media. You had to get out and play to a crowd, ideally for as many days of the year as you possibly could. This, though, became a big problem for Death. In 1990, they were set to head out on a European tour with Creator to support their third studio record, Spiritual Healing, and Chuck decided he didn't want the tour to go ahead due to it being poorly organized. Death, however, carried on without Chuck and brought in a different vocalist and guitarist, which to almost every Death fan was, and still is to this day, considered a form of what you could call blasphemy. Chuck had started acting kind of weird on that second tour, and by the time we got home, we dropped him off at home. We were going to get together and rehearse a couple of times before Europe, and he was just AWOL. He was gone. No one could find him. Long story short, we got our booking agent and agreed we were just going to go over without Chuck. He was just checking out of that tour. His mindset was, a girlfriend just broke up with him, and I don't know. He was getting a little bit tired of the straight death metal stuff. It was a huge mess. In hindsight, was it the best thing to do? I'm not sure. Death is Chuck Schuldiner, and Chuck Schuldiner is Death. Death touring without Chuck is akin to Motorhead touring without Lemmy. Chuck officially parted ways with the rest of the group and retained the Death name.
All the big names from hard rock and heavy metal are in the same place at the same time.
Death would see multiple lineup changes almost on a yearly basis, sparking rumors that maybe Chuck Schuldiner simply wasn't an easy guy to work with, although Chuck himself said he simply found it difficult to find the right people to carry out his vision. Schuldiner essentially became the face of the band as Death saw a total of over 25 different members come and go during his tenure. This also meant, though, that Chuck was able to retain more control of musical direction.
Some people are putting it in a particular lyrical mode. I feel, from being around a long time and being in this for such a long time, playing this type of music, I feel that I shouldn't put a limit on myself lyrically. That's why you don't hear Death singing about demons flying down and plucking nuns from the earth. That's idiotic. That's putting a limit on people's mentality or whatever, or it's just limiting. I feel that Death is a band that I can put my personal outlook on certain things in life into.
Spiritual Healing, the third studio album by Death, would be released on the 16th of February 1990 and saw Chuck's lyrics depart from fictional gore to real-life horror, serial killers, and televangelists.
Breaking the mold of you, only gathering escape.
The cover itself depicts a televangelist, although which one has never been confirmed. Some think it may be Peter George Popoff. A televangelist is basically a religious preacher that mostly spreads their message of faith via the television. This concept grew enormously during the 80s and 90s, and figures such as Popoff and Kenneth Copeland were making millions of dollars a year from donations given to them by the general public.
I receive you as my Lord, my Savior, my provider, my everything. You're now my Father, and I just praise you and worship you and thank you for it.
In the late 80s, Popoff as a television preacher was collecting close to $4 million per year in donations, and by 2005, well over 20 million.
Take a few steps just to make the devil mad. Hallelujah, that's it. Just move around a little bit. There she goes.
After this, Popoff turned the organization into a religious organization in order to avoid paying tax. Some sources even suggest that Kenneth Copeland today is worth over $700 million. Popoff was also exposed to scamming his audience. In 1986, he was claiming to receive miracle messages from God. God was telling him the names of audience members and what illnesses they had so that he could cure them. It turns out his wife was just telling him this information through a well-hidden earpiece. Not so miracle. From a musical standpoint, however, it would appear that Chuck was trying to move even further away from the original Death sound. When Spiritual Healing came out, a lot of people said that parts of it didn't sound deathish, and I wanted to make a record that was pure death. You can't have people just come in and start writing for an established band. You have to make sure that your music remains what people expect it to be. It's hard to find people that share my musical goal. It is a delicate process that has become a more natural one. It is important for the rhythms to become an actual part of the lead. They need to share a relationship. A lot of the stuff you might hear that turns people off lead work is when the rhythm goes nowhere, and the lead goes in the opposite direction. I pay a lot of attention to the rhythms underneath. That makes for that meant to be feeling. Although Death weren't exactly topping the Billboard charts, they were becoming well known and started to appear on MTV and Headbangers Ball. And their fourth studio album, Human, did actually briefly appear on the Billboard Heatseekers charts in 1991 at number 34. Yet despite this ever-increasing success, Chuck Schuldiner kind of felt as if the world, or at least the world of the music industry, was out to get him and bring him and his band down.
I like to look at them as obstacles, and I feel it's good to learn from your mistakes, perhaps, if you want to call them that, or problems. And I think a lot of the personal emotion came into the music this time around more than ever. I felt I was going against a lot of odds due to the fact that there was very negative press and a lot of people literally trying to drag my name as a person and as a band through the mud. And I feel like I'm back on top of things, and I feel I've bettered myself through what I had to do. And I feel the album definitely conveys a certain message.
It seemed that not only was Chuck constantly trying to develop musically, but also on a personal and emotional level as well. After all, he was only 15 when he started the band in the first place. During the 1990s, Death would release 5 studio albums in total: Spiritual Healing in 1990, Human in 1991, Individual Thought Patterns in 1993, Symbolic in 1995, and The Sound of Perseverance in 1998.
Only death of greatness day. No
Plenty of arguments and debates across the internet regarding which album is the best, along with which lineup was the best. Most fans, though, can agree that each record showcased an ever-increasing display of musical development on Chuck's part. And we also can't forget the possible influence that some of the many members he worked with may have contributed to this, such as Andy LaRocque, longtime guitarist for King Diamond, James Murphy from the Spiritual Era, and many others, but that in itself could be an entirely separate story. It's always interesting to see which albums fans consider to be the best record by a group. Some will always cite the first Death record. After all, Scream Bloody Gore is said to be the first real death metal record of the genre, whereas other fans and music critics will tell you Symbolic, the sixth studio record by Death, released in 1995, is not only the best death record, but also the best death metal record of all time, which is quite a statement. However, by this time we saw Cannibal Corpse landing a Billboard 200 chart position with their fifth studio album Vile, released in '96, although they had some incredible exposure by appearing in the Jim Carrey film Ace Ventura: Pet Detective. This obviously doesn't mean that Vile is or was a better record than anything Death have ever released. It's just an interesting comparison to the fact that Cannibal Corpse was seeing much more commercial success compared to Death. And I can't help but wonder if Death had had a more consistent lineup and managed to fulfill more tour dates if they would have seen more commercial success. But I guess for that we'll never know. I know some people will be wondering why I didn't talk about this or that album, and even why I didn't go in depth into the actual evolution of Death's music. Over the years, it did drastically change. It started out as death metal and transformed into more technical death metal with elements of progressive metal, focusing more on composition and structure. While this is an entirely different story, and I will cover the music of Death in a deep dive video in the future, covering every single album and the evolution of their sound. But as I said, that is for another time and probably won't happen for a while.
Well, I like to think that we're taking it to a new level each record. I want to stay musical and put in my influences, which have to do with a lot of melodic bands, anything from Merciful Fate, King Diamond, to a lot of bands, Watchtower, Queensryche, a lot of old heavier stuff like Possessed. I'm trying to incorporate all my personal tastes, influences and stuff, and let them come out. I'm not into holding back, trying to live up to a certain reputation of being the heaviest. I'm not out for that.
Sadly, however, for Chuck, no amount of personal nor musical development could prevent his cancer diagnosis in 1999. A diagnosis that ultimately meant his life was to be extremely short-lived. With Death, Chuck would release 7 studio albums in total, the last being The Sound of Perseverance in 1998. He also released a record with German heavy metal band Voodoo Cult in '94, and his final album would be The Fragile Art of Existence, with another band he founded called Control Denied, released in 1999. Okay, before we finish up here, I've set myself a target to try and beat this guy on Instagram, and I've got about 100-something thousand followers to go. So if you want to help me out, please do drop me a follow. There's a link in the description, and I would greatly appreciate it. His music is timeless. It still sounds as fresh as it did when it came out. Plus, Chuck's style on guitar is unmatched. It's the perfect mix of melody, technicality, and brutality. I'm extremely lucky to have been not just part of the band, but also a close friend of Chuck's. He inspired me, and he continues to inspire me every day. Chuck poured his heart and soul into everything he tried to accomplish with music, right up until the very end. He drove himself unmercifully that last year. We worried so much about him and begged him to rest. As the perfectionist he is, he said it was just okay and that wasn't good enough for him or his fans. He would go on until he couldn't anymore. Chuck Schuldiner died on the 13th of December 2001. He was just 34 years of age. The legacy that Death and Chuck Schuldiner left behind is one that can rarely be matched. Death was a pioneering band, and Death was Chuck Schuldiner.